I was halfway through my morning coffee when someone started pounding on my front door like the police were serving a warrant. And I knew immediately it had to be one of the HOA board members because normal people don't knock like that at 7 in the morning. I set down my mug and walked to the door, already feeling my jaw tighten. I had been living in the Riverside Meadows community in Gilbert, Arizona for exactly 3 weeks, and in those 3 weeks, I had received more violation notices than I had in my entire life living anywhere else. My grass was a 1/4 inch too long. My car was parked 2 inches over my driveway line. My trash can was visible from the street for approximately 45 minutes past the allowed time. It was exhausting, and I was a patient man, but everyone has their limits. When I opened the door, there she stood. Patricia Henderson, the HOA president, a woman in her late 40s with blonde hair styled in that specific "can I speak to your manager" cut that had become a universal warning sign. She wore a bright pink tracksuit despite the Arizona heat already climbing toward 90 degrees, and she had her phone out, taking photos of something. "Can I help you, Patricia?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. She didn't even look up from her phone. "You certainly can, Keith. You can start by clearing the snow and ice from my walkway like you're supposed to." I blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "The snow," she repeated, finally looking at me with those sharp blue eyes that seemed perpetually annoyed. "From my walkway. It's a hazard, and according to HOA Guidelines Section 12, Paragraph 4, all residents are responsible for maintaining safe walking conditions on shared pathways." I stepped out onto my porch and looked around. It was July, in Arizona. The temperature was already approaching 90 degrees, and the forecast said it would hit 108 by afternoon. There was no snow. There had never been snow. There would not be snow for months, if at all. "Patricia, there's no snow. It's July. We're in Arizona." Her face flushed red, and I watched her jaw clench. "Don't get smart with me, Keith Lawson. I know what I saw. There was ice on the pathway between our properties this morning, and it's your responsibility to clear it. There's literally no ice. It's 90 degrees. Are you calling me a liar?" Her voice rose an octave, and I saw curtains moving in windows across the street. Great. An audience. I took a deep breath. "I'm saying there's no ice to clear. If you saw something slippery on the path, it was probably morning dew, which evaporates on its own. I want it cleared within the hour, or I'm filing a formal complaint with the board." She crossed her arms, phone still clutched in one hand. "You are the board, Patricia. You're the president. Then I'll file it with myself, and it will go on your permanent record." She turned on her heel and marched back toward her house, which was directly next to mine, unfortunately. I watched her go, counting to 10 in my head. This was my life now. This was what I dealt with every single day since moving into this neighborhood. Patricia Henderson had made it her personal mission to make my existence miserable, and I couldn't figure out why. I kept my property immaculate. I followed every rule, no matter how ridiculous. I smiled and waved when I saw her. Nothing worked. What Patricia didn't know, what nobody in this neighborhood knew yet, was that my life was about to change dramatically. And so was hers. I went back inside and finished my coffee, then headed to my home office. I had a video conference at 8 with my business partner, Marcus Chen, and we had a lot to discuss. 3 months ago, Marcus and I had pooled our resources and purchased a small real estate investment company that owned several rental properties in the Gilbert area. It was a risk, a big one, but the numbers made sense, and we both wanted to build something significant. The previous owner had been an older gentleman named Robert Fitzpatrick, who was retiring to Florida. He had been managing the properties himself for years, and his record keeping was, to put it charitably, disorganized. We had spent the last 3 months sorting through paperwork, meeting tenants, inspecting properties, and figuring out exactly what we had bought. Marcus's face appeared on my screen at exactly 8 o'clock. He was sitting in his own home office in Scottsdale, about 30 minutes away, and he looked excited. "Keith, man, you're not going to believe what I found last night." "Good morning to you too," I said, grinning. Yeah, good morning. Listen, I was going through the last batch of property files from Fitzpatrick's archive, the ones that were in that water-damaged box we almost threw out. I found something interesting. He held up a folder to the camera, and I could see it was labeled with an address. An address that made my stomach drop. Is that 742 Riverside Meadows Drive, your neighbor, Patricia Henderson's house? Marcus was practically bouncing in his chair. "Keith, we own her house." "Well, the company owns it. Fitzpatrick sold it to her parents about 15 years ago, but he kept the property in his portfolio as an investment. They never bought it outright. They've been renting it this whole time, and when they passed away 2 years ago, Patricia just took over the lease and kept paying rent." I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. "You're telling me that Patricia Henderson, the HOA president who has been making my life hell for 3 weeks, is actually my tenant?" "Our tenant, but yes. And here's where it gets better." Marcus shuffled through some papers. "Her lease is month to month. Has been since her parents died. And according to these payment records, she's been late on rent 4 times in the last 6 months. Fitzpatrick just let it slide because he was old and didn't want to deal with it. Does she know the property changed hands? She should. We sent out letters to all tenants 2 months ago informing them of the ownership transfer and providing new payment information. But Marcus pulled up something on his computer. Looking at our records, she hasn't updated her payment method. She's still sending checks to Fitzpatrick's old P.O. box, which he's not checking anymore because he's in Florida. So she hasn't paid rent in 2 months. Exactly. And under Arizona landlord-tenant law, we can issue a 5-day notice to pay or quit. If she doesn't pay within 5 days, we can proceed with eviction. I should have felt triumphant. Patricia had been a nightmare. She had accused me of violating HOA rules I hadn't broken. She had harassed me about imaginary snow in the middle of an Arizona summer. She had made me dread coming home to my own house. But instead, I just felt tired. "Let's send her a letter first," I said. "A friendly one, explaining the situation, giving her the new payment information, and letting her know she's behind. Maybe this is all just a misunderstanding." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You're being awfully generous to someone who tried to fine you $200 for having the wrong shade of beige on your mailbox." "I know. But let's try to do this right. If she doesn't respond or refuses to pay, then we'll move forward with the legal process." We spent the rest of the call going over other properties and business matters, but my mind kept drifting back to Patricia. The woman who had been treating me like garbage was actually depending on me for her housing. The irony was almost too perfect. After the call, I drafted a letter. I kept it professional and cordial, explaining that the property had changed ownership, providing new payment details, and noting that she was currently 2 months behind on rent totaling $3,400. I requested that she contact me at her earliest convenience to discuss a payment plan if needed. I printed it, signed it, put it in an envelope, and walked next door. Patricia's house was identical to mine in layout, but completely different in execution. Where I had kept things simple and clean, her yard was full of decorative touches. Pink flamingos lined the walkway. Wind chimes hung from the porch. A large wooden sign near the door read "Henderson House" in curling script. I rang the doorbell and waited. She answered quickly, still in her pink tracksuit, and her expression soured the moment she saw me. If you're here to apologize for your attitude this morning, I'm willing to accept, but I still expect that walkway cleared. Patricia, I need to talk to you about something important. Can I come in? Absolutely not. Whatever you have to say, you can say it right here. Fair enough. I held out the envelope. I'm not here as your neighbor, I'm here as your landlord. My business partner and I purchased the company that owns this property. You're 2 months behind on rent and we need to resolve this. She took the envelope like it might explode, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and then anger in rapid succession. She tore it open and scanned the letter, her lips moving slightly as she read. "This is ridiculous," she said finally. "I pay my rent on time every month. I have for years. You've been sending checks to an address that's no longer monitored. The previous owner retired and moved to Florida. We sent out notification letters 2 months ago. I never received any letter. We sent them certified mail to all tenants. Well, I didn't get one." She thrust the letter back at me. "And I'm not paying you anything until I verify this with my lawyer." "That's your right. But I need to inform you that under Arizona law, if payment isn't received within 5 days of this notice, we'll have to begin eviction proceedings." Her face went from red to purple. "You can't evict me. I'm the HOA president. I have rights." "Your HOA position doesn't affect your lease obligations. I'm trying to work with you here, Patricia. If you need a payment plan, we can discuss that. But the rent needs to be paid. Get off my property. It's my property, actually. Get off." She slammed the door so hard the wind chimes jangled violently. I walked back to my house, feeling the weight of what was coming. This wasn't going to be resolved quietly or easily. Patricia Henderson wasn't the type to admit she was wrong about anything, and now I had just threatened her housing security. I had a feeling the HOA violations were about to get a lot worse. I was right. The next morning, I woke up to find a neon orange violation notice stuck to my front door. According to Patricia's extremely detailed report, my house numbers were not regulation size. They needed to be exactly 4 inches tall, and mine were 3.75 inches. I had 24 hours to replace them or face a $50 fine. I measured my house numbers. They were exactly 4 inches tall. I took photos with a ruler clearly visible and emailed them to the HOA board, which consisted of Patricia and 2 other people who apparently just rubber-stamped whatever she wanted. That afternoon, another violation. My front door wreath was not pre-approved. I didn't have a wreath. I sent photos of my wreathless door. The day after that, a violation for having a commercial vehicle parked in my driveway. My car was a Honda Civic. I sent photos of my very obviously non-commercial sedan. It went on like this for 3 days. Patricia was spiraling, using the HOA as a weapon, and she didn't care how ridiculous her accusations became. On day 4, I received a formal letter from the HOA stating that I was being fined $500 for general neighborhood disruption and failure to maintain community standards. I called Marcus. "We need to move forward with the eviction." She didn't pay, she didn't even respond, and she's been filing fake HOA violations against me all week. This has gone beyond a simple rent dispute. All right, I'll have our attorney draft the 5-day notice. But Keith, you need to be prepared. This is going to get ugly. The 5-day notice to pay or quit was delivered by a process server on a Friday afternoon. I watched from my window as the man handed Patricia the papers at her door. She read them right there, and I saw her face transform into something almost frightening. She looked directly at my house, and I swear I could feel the hatred radiating across the 20 feet between our properties. Within an hour, I had a new violation notice, and another. And another. By the end of the day, I had accumulated 17 violation notices, including one claiming my roof was the wrong color, despite it being the exact color specified in the HOA guidelines. But I also had something else. Marcus called me at 6 p.m., his voice tense. "Keith, I just got a very interesting email. Patricia's attorney sent a cease and desist, claiming we're harassing his client and that the eviction notice is retaliatory." Retaliatory for what? For her exercising her duties as HOA president. They're claiming that because you're facing HOA violations, you're retaliating by abusing your position as landlord. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's backwards. She's filing fake violations because I'm collecting rent she owes. I know that. You know that. Our attorney knows that. But her lawyer is arguing that she was filing violations before the rent issue came up, and therefore your eviction is retaliation for her doing her job. The violation started after I delivered the first notice about back rent. Can you prove that? I thought about it. The HOA violation notices are dated, and I have the certified mail receipt for the rent letter. The dates will show she started the violation blitz after being notified about the rent. Good. Document everything. Every violation notice, every interaction, everything. Our attorney says this is pretty clearly a bad faith argument on her part, but we need to be bulletproof on this. The 5 days came and went. Patricia didn't pay. She didn't contact us. She didn't acknowledge the notice in any way except to continue her campaign of fake HOA violations. I now had 34 violation notices, and the fines she was claiming totaled over $4,000. On day 6, our attorney filed for eviction in the Gilbert Justice Court. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. Arizona has relatively fast eviction processes compared to some states, but it still felt like an eternity knowing I had to live next to Patricia while this played out. Marcus and I met with our attorney, a sharp woman in her 50s named Sandra Ortega, who specialized in landlord-tenant law. She had been practicing in Arizona for 25 years and had seen everything. "This is one of the more blatant cases of tenant harassment I've encountered," Sandra said, flipping through the stack of violation notices I had brought. "She's not even trying to hide it. Some of these are physically impossible. You can't have a vehicle parked illegally in your driveway and also have an empty driveway, but she's claiming both on the same day." "What are our chances?" I asked, "in the eviction hearing?" "Excellent. She owes rent, she was properly notified, and she's failed to pay. That's pretty cut and dry. The retaliation claim is nonsense, and I can demonstrate that easily. What I'm more concerned about is what happens after." "What do you mean?" Sandra leaned back in her chair. "Patricia Henderson has been HOA president for 6 years. I looked into it. She runs that board like a fiefdom, and she's made enemies. Lots of them. But she's also careful enough that nobody's been able to successfully challenge her. She knows the rules and she uses them like weapons. When we win this eviction, and we will win it, she's going to be angry and embarrassed. People like that don't just accept defeat. So what do I do? Document everything. Install security cameras if you haven't already. Don't engage with her directly unless witnesses are present. And be prepared for her to escalate before this is over." I installed cameras that afternoon. Front door, back door, driveway, and side yard. High definition with night vision and cloud storage. If Patricia tried anything, I would have proof. The retaliation came faster than expected. 2 days after the eviction was filed, I came home from a meeting to find my yard had been vandalized. Someone had spray painted orange X marks all over my lawn, my driveway, and the front of my house. They looked like the marks utility companies make when they're planning construction. Except there was no planned construction, and utility companies don't mark at night when nobody's watching. I checked my security cameras. The footage showed Patricia leaving her house at 2 a.m., spray paint can in hand, and methodically marking up my property. She looked directly at one of my cameras at one point, and she didn't care. She wanted me to know it was her. I called Sandra immediately, even though it was early morning. She answered on the second ring. "Tell me you have video evidence." Crystal clear. She looked right at the camera. "Email it to me now. We're filing a police report and adding this to our case. This is vandalism, and it's witness intimidation. She's trying to scare you into dropping the eviction." I filed the police report online and emailed the footage to both Sandra and the Gilbert Police Department. An officer came out that afternoon to take my statement and look at the damage. He was a young guy, probably late 20s, and he seemed genuinely angry on my behalf. "This is stupid," Officer Martinez said, shaking his head as he looked at the spray paint. "She knows you have cameras. She had to have seen them. Why would she do this?" "Because she thinks she's untouchable," I said. "She's been HOA president for 6 years and nobody's ever successfully stood up to her." "Well, vandalism is vandalism. The video is clear. We'll be filing charges and the prosecutor will decide how to proceed. But between you and me, she's looking at criminal damage charges at minimum. Will she be arrested? Depends on the prosecutor and the judge, but she'll definitely be charged." Officer Martinez took photos, collected my statement, and left. I spent the rest of the day trying to remove spray paint from my property. The marks on the lawn would fade with time and watering, but the driveway and house required chemical removers and a lot of scrubbing. I was still at it when I heard Patricia's voice behind me. "You're not supposed to have visible cleaning supplies stored outside. That's a violation." I turned slowly, still holding the scrub brush and bottle of cleaner. Patricia stood at the property line, phone out, taking photos. She looked completely unbothered by the fact that I was cleaning up vandalism she had committed, vandalism that was on video. "Patricia, the police have video of you doing this. You're going to be charged with criminal damage." "I don't know what you're talking about. I was asleep all night." "You looked directly at my camera while spray painting my house. I think the stress of your upcoming financial problems is making you paranoid. I heard that eviction proceedings can be very expensive for landlords, especially when they lose and have to pay the tenants legal fees. You're not going to win this. We'll see. In the meantime, you're storing cleaning supplies in violation of HOA guidelines, so that's another fine." She lowered her phone and walked away, leaving me standing there covered in spray paint residue and rage. The week before the eviction hearing was surreal. Patricia continued to file violation notices, sometimes 3 or 4 a day. My mailbox was the wrong shade of metallic. My grass had an unauthorized clover growing in it. My outdoor light fixtures were too bright, too dim. The wrong color temperature. Each violation notice came with a fine, and the total she was claiming I owed now exceeded $10,000. But I also started hearing from other residents. People I had barely spoken to began stopping by or sending me emails. They had stories about Patricia. The couple 3 houses down had been fined $800 because their daughter drew hopscotch squares on their driveway with chalk. A retired veteran had been reported to code enforcement for displaying an American flag that Patricia claimed was too large, even though it was standard size. A single mother had been harassed for months because Patricia didn't like that she parked her slightly older car on the street instead of in her garage. One evening, a woman knocked on my door. Her name was Rachel Turner, and she lived 4 houses down from me. She was in her 30s with tired eyes and a determined set to her jaw. "I heard you're taking Patricia to court," she said. "It's an eviction hearing. She hasn't paid rent." I know, and I know it's probably not my place, but I wanted to offer to testify if it helps, about the HOA stuff, about how she uses her position. Testify to what? Rachel took a breath. 2 years ago, Patricia decided she didn't like my landscaping, said the roses I planted weren't on the approved list. They absolutely were, I had checked, but she didn't care. She filed violations weekly. Then she got the HOA to put a lien on my house for unpaid fines. Fines for violations I never actually committed. I had to hire a lawyer and fight it. Cost me $3,000 in legal fees, but we proved she had fabricated most of the violations. The lien was removed, but she never faced any consequences. She's still HOA president. She's still doing this to people. I invited Rachel in and heard the whole story. It was worse than I thought. Patricia had been systematically targeting residents she didn't like for years. Most people just paid the fines because fighting them cost more than the fines themselves. Those who did fight, like Rachel, won, but it was expensive and exhausting. Patricia had created a system where she could abuse her power with minimal consequences because the barrier to fighting back was so high. I can't testify at the eviction hearing, I told Rachel. That's specifically about rent and lease violations, but this is good to know. If she tries to fight the eviction based on the HOA violations she's claiming I committed, this establishes a pattern of behavior. Rachel nodded. Just let me know if you need anything. A lot of us are rooting for you. Patricia has made life miserable here for too long. After Rachel left, I sat in my living room and thought about what to do with this information. The eviction was straightforward. Patricia owed rent. She hadn't paid. We had followed the legal process correctly. We were going to win. But the bigger issue was the HOA and Patricia's abuse of power. I called Marcus. How many properties do we own in Riverside Meadows? Let me check. I heard typing. 4, including Patricia's. Why? That means we have 4 votes in HOA elections, right? Property owners get to vote. Technically, yes, but in communities where the property is rented, the vote usually defaults to the tenant unless the owner specifically claims it. Can we claim it? More typing. Looking at the HOA bylaws, yes. We need to file a declaration of owner voting rights with the board at least 30 days before an election. Keith, what are you thinking? I'm thinking Patricia's term as president is up in November. I'm thinking we have 4 votes, and I bet we can convince a lot of other residents to vote her out if they know there's a realistic chance of winning. Marcus was quiet for a moment. That's a long game. The eviction is in 3 days. I know. But even if we win the eviction, Patricia has poisoned this community. She needs to be removed from power or she'll just keep doing this to other people. All right. I'll start pulling together the information, but let's win the eviction first. The eviction hearing was on a Wednesday morning at 9 a.m. I dressed in a suit and tie, gathered all my documentation, and met Marcus and Sandra at the Justice Court building in Gilbert. It was a modern building, all glass and steel, and it was already hot outside despite the early hour. Patricia arrived with her attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as James Brennan. He barely acknowledged me, spending his time whispering intently with Patricia in the hallway outside the courtroom. Patricia had also dressed up, wearing a conservative blue dress and pearls, her hair styled perfectly. She looked like someone's kind grandmother, not a woman who had spray-painted my house at 2 a.m. When we were called into the courtroom, the judge was a stern-looking woman in her 60s named Judge Carolyn Reeves. Sandra had told me Judge Reeves was fair but no nonsense. She didn't tolerate games from either side. The hearing began with Sandra presenting our case. It was simple. We own the property. Patricia had a month-to-month lease. She owed rent for 3 months now, as another month had passed since we filed. She had been properly notified. She had not paid. Under Arizona law, we were entitled to possession of the property. Sandra presented the lease, the payment records, the certified mail receipts for our notices, and the 5-day notice to pay or quit. Everything was in order, meticulously documented. James Brennan stood for Patricia's defense. Your Honor, my client is not disputing the rent owed. However, we contend that this eviction is retaliatory in nature and therefore improper under Arizona Revised Statute Section 33-1381. Judge Reeves looked up from her notes. You're claiming retaliation. What are you claiming the tenant is being retaliated against for? My client is the president of the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association. As part of her duties, she has filed legitimate HOA violations against Mr. Lawson. In response, Mr. Lawson initiated eviction proceedings as punishment for her exercising her responsibilities. Sandra stood. Your Honor, may I respond? Judge Reeves nodded. Sandra walked forward with a timeline she had prepared. The alleged retaliation doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Mrs. Henderson was first notified about her rent arrears on July 15th. She received the formal 5-day notice on July 22nd. The first HOA violation she filed against Mr. Lawson was July 16th, the day after receiving the rent notice. Prior to being notified about the rent issue, Mrs. Henderson had filed 0 violations against Mr. Lawson. After being notified, she filed 38 violations in a 3-week period. If anything, the HOA violations appear to be retaliatory against the landlord for collecting legally owed rent. James Brennan opened his mouth to respond, but Judge Reeves held up a hand. Do you have evidence that Mr. Lawson's property was in violation before he notified your client about the rent? Your Honor, the violations are documented with dates and photographs. That's not what I asked. Do you have evidence that the violations existed before the rent notice? Brennan shuffled through his papers. The violations were observed and documented by my client in her capacity as HOA president. After being notified about the rent, do you have any evidence, any complaints, any documentation of issues with Mr. Lawson's property before July 15th? The violations speak for themselves, Your Honor. Judge Reeves looked at Patricia directly. Mrs. Henderson, did you file any HOA complaints against Mr. Lawson before you received notice about your rent arrears? Patricia stood. I had observed issues with his property, yes. Did you file any official complaints or violations before July 15th? I was preparing to. That's a no, then. Judge Reeves looked back at the documents in front of her. Mr. Brennan, the timeline presented by the plaintiff's attorney is clear. Your client was notified about rent arrears. The very next day, she began filing violations. That's the opposite of retaliation. That suggests your client is using her HOA position as leverage in a landlord-tenant dispute, which is inappropriate. Your Honor, with respect, my client has a right to enforce HOA regulations. She does, but the court is not here to litigate HOA violations. We're here to determine if the eviction is proper. The plaintiff has demonstrated that rent is owed, notices were properly given, and the tenant has failed to cure the default. Unless you have evidence that the landlord failed to follow proper procedure or that the rent is not actually owed, I'm not seeing a defense here. Brennan looked at Patricia, who whispered something to him urgently. He nodded and turned back to the judge. Your Honor, my client is prepared to pay the back rent today. We request dismissal of the eviction. Sandra stood immediately. Your Honor, the tenant has had months to pay. She's only offering payment now to avoid eviction. Under the circumstances, particularly given the tenant's harassment of the landlord. We request that the eviction proceed regardless of payment." Judge Reeves considered this. "Mr. Lawson, are you willing to accept payment and continue the tenancy?" I stood when Sandra nodded at me. "No, Your Honor. Mrs. Henderson has demonstrated that she's not a suitable tenant. Beyond the rent issues, she vandalized my property, which is documented on security footage and is currently subject to criminal charges. I can't maintain a professional landlord-tenant relationship with someone who spray paints my house at 2 in the morning." There was a moment of silence in the courtroom. Judge Reeves looked at Brennan. "Your client is facing criminal charges related to this property." Brennan looked uncomfortable. "There are allegations, Your Honor, but my client maintains her innocence. Are there charges filed?" Sandra stepped forward. "Yes, Your Honor. The Gilbert Police Department has filed criminal damage charges. I have the case number if you'd like it for the record." Judge Reeves made a note. "That won't be necessary for this proceeding, but it's relevant to the landlord's decision not to continue the tenancy." She looked at Patricia, and her expression was cold. "Mrs. Henderson, is there any reason you didn't pay your rent for 3 months?" Patricia stood again, her composure cracking slightly. "I sent my checks like I always do. It's not my fault if there was a processing error. You were notified in writing that the property ownership had changed and that you needed to update your payment method. Why didn't you do that?" "I never received that notice. It was sent certified mail. The signature on the receipt is yours." Brennan whispered something to Patricia, who clenched her jaw and sat down. Judge Reeves shuffled her papers together. "I find for the plaintiff, Mrs. Henderson, you have 7 days to vacate the property. The court orders you to pay the plaintiff the full amount of back rent owed, which is $5,100 for 3 months, plus court costs. If you fail to vacate within 7 days, the sheriff will remove you and your belongings." This hearing is concluded. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. It was over. We had won. Patricia stood so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. She turned to me and her face was twisted with rage. "This isn't over. You think you can just throw me out of my home? I will make your life hell. Every single day I will make you regret this." "Mrs. Henderson," Judge Reeves said sharply, "that statement borders on threatening. I suggest you leave this courtroom now before I hold you in contempt." Brennan took Patricia's arm and practically dragged her out of the courtroom. I could hear her voice echoing in the hallway, loud and angry, but I couldn't make out the words. Sandra turned to me and Marcus with a satisfied expression. "Well, that went about as well as we could have hoped." "She threatened me right in front of the judge," I said, "and the judge heard it. If Patricia tries anything else, that threat is on record. But Keith, I meant what I said before. She's going to escalate. 7 days is not a lot of time, and people get desperate when they're losing their homes." "What should I do?" "Keep your cameras running. Don't go near her property. Don't engage with her at all. If she contacts you, document it, but don't respond. Let me handle all communication. And maybe consider staying somewhere else for the next week if you can." I didn't want to leave my home, especially not because Patricia had scared me out of it. But Sandra's concern was genuine, and I trusted her judgment. Marcus offered to let me stay at his place in Scottsdale, and after some thought, I agreed. Better safe than sorry. I spent that afternoon packing a bag and making sure my security system was working perfectly. I set it to alert me immediately if there was any motion detected on my property. Then I got in my car and drove to Marcus's place, watching my house disappear in the rearview mirror and wondering what condition it would be in when I returned. The first 2 days were quiet. Patricia's car remained at her house, and I could see her coming and going on my security cameras, but she didn't approach my property. She didn't file any HOA violations. It was eerily peaceful. On day 3, I got a call from Rachel Turner, my neighbor who had offered to testify. "Keith, I don't know if you're home, but you should know there's a moving truck at Patricia's house. She's loading stuff." "That's good, right? She's moving out voluntarily." "Maybe, but I've been watching and she's making multiple trips back and forth. Sometimes she's carrying boxes. Sometimes she's carrying nothing, and she keeps looking at your house." A chill ran down my spine. "Can you see what she's doing when she goes to my house?" "She's not going to your house. She's just staring at it. It's creepy, Keith." I pulled up my security camera feeds on my phone. Sure enough, there was Patricia, standing at the property line between our houses, just staring at my front door. As I watched, she took out her phone and appeared to take photos. Then she walked back to her house and disappeared inside. "Rachel, can you keep watching for me? Let me know if anything weird happens." "Of course. Be careful, Keith." I watched my camera feeds obsessively for the rest of the day. Patricia made several more trips to and from the moving truck, and each time she paused to stare at my house. It was unnerving, watching her fixate on my property like that, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was planning something. At 8 p.m., my phone exploded with alerts. Motion detected at front door. Motion detected at side yard. Motion detected at back door, all at the same time. I pulled up the feeds. Patricia was at my front door doing something I couldn't quite see. The angle was wrong. I switched to the side yard camera and watched as someone else, a man I didn't recognize, was trying to open my side gate. The back door camera showed Patricia's car parked in my driveway, blocking the view. I called 911 immediately. "This is Keith Lawson at 740 Riverside Meadows Drive in Gilbert. Someone is actively trespassing on my property. I have it on video. I'm not home, but they're trying to break in." The dispatcher was calm and professional. "Are you sure they're trying to break in? I have security cameras. There are multiple people on my property right now, and they don't have permission to be there. Officers are on the way. Stay on the line with me." I watched my camera feeds, heart pounding. Patricia was at my front door, and now I could see what she was doing. She was spreading something, liquid, a lot of it. It was running down my door and pooling on my porch. The man at the side gate had gotten it open and was walking toward my backyard. "They're spreading some kind of liquid on my front door," I told the dispatcher. "I don't know what it is. Officers are 3 minutes away." Patricia finished with whatever she was doing and walked quickly back to her house. The man in my yard stopped, looked around, and pulled out what looked like a lighter. "He has a lighter," I shouted into the phone. "They're trying to set my house on fire. Officers are pulling up now." On my camera feed, I saw police lights flashing red and blue. 2 patrol cars pulled into the cul-de-sac fast, and officers jumped out. The man in my yard saw them and ran, vaulting over my back fence. Patricia stood frozen on her front porch, caught in the open. The next hour was a blur of phone calls. The officers called me to confirm I was the homeowner, and that I hadn't given anyone permission to be on my property. I sent them the video footage, which clearly showed Patricia spreading what turned out to be gasoline on my front door while her accomplice prepared to light it. They arrested Patricia right there in her driveway. The man who had been in my yard got away initially, but they caught him 2 blocks away. His name was Derek Henderson, Patricia's brother, and he was already on probation for arson from 5 years ago. I drove back to my house immediately, breaking every speed limit. When I arrived, the scene was surreal. Police cars everywhere. Crime scene tape. Neighbors standing in clusters, watching. My front porch reeked of gasoline, and there were evidence markers all over my property. Officer Martinez was there, the same one who had taken my report about the spray paint. He saw me and walked over. "Mr. Lawson, hell of a situation here. Is my house okay?" "It's fine. They didn't get a chance to light it. But if you hadn't called when you did, if we'd been even a minute later, they would have succeeded. This whole porch would have gone up, and with the gasoline they used, the fire would have spread fast." I felt sick. Patricia had tried to burn down my house. With me in it, she had thought, since she didn't know I was staying somewhere else. What's going to happen to her? She's being charged with attempted arson, criminal damage, conspiracy, and a few other things. Her brother's charges are even worse since he's on probation. They're both in custody, and I doubt either of them is getting bail. Attempted arson is serious, especially with the premeditation involved here. There's video of everything, crystal clear. They're done, Mr. Lawson. They're going away for a long time. The police finished processing the scene around midnight. They took all my security footage as evidence and gave me a case number. A hazmat team came to clean up the gasoline, declaring my house safe to enter around 2 a.m. I was exhausted, but there was no way I could sleep. I sat on my couch as the sun came up, thinking about how close I had come to losing everything. My house. Maybe my life if I had been home. All because Patricia couldn't accept that she had to pay rent like everyone else. Sandra called me at 8 a.m. She had already heard about the arrest. "Keith, I'm so sorry. I warned you she might escalate, but I never imagined this. Is the eviction still valid, with her in jail?" "Yes. Actually, this makes it simpler. She's not going to be able to contest anything from a jail cell. I'll file for immediate possession, and we'll get the sheriff to remove her belongings. Do you know if she has family who can collect her things?" Her brother was the one helping her try to burn down my house. He's in jail too. Then her belongings will be stored according to Arizona law, and she can arrange to collect them after she's released, which won't be for a while. "Keith, you need to understand something. With her criminal charges, Patricia is looking at real prison time. Attempted arson carries a mandatory minimum sentence in Arizona. She's not going to be your neighbor anymore. She's not going to be anyone's neighbor for years." It should have felt like victory. Patricia had terrorized me for weeks, violated every rule of decent behavior, and then tried to commit what amounted to attempted murder. She was going to face consequences. Real ones. But I just felt hollow. The community reaction was swift and complicated. Some neighbors, like Rachel, were supportive and sympathetic. They brought food and offered help cleaning up the remaining evidence of Patricia's crime. Others were shocked that Patricia, who they thought was just an overzealous HOA president, had been capable of attempted arson. And then there were the ones who blamed me. A man named Donald Pierce, who lived at the end of the street, actually came to my door to tell me that I had pushed Patricia too far, and that I should have just paid the HOA fines instead of causing trouble. I closed the door in his face. But Donald wasn't alone in his thinking. There was a small but vocal group who seemed to think that Patricia's breakdown was somehow my fault, that I should have been more understanding, that evicting her was cruel. These people clearly didn't know about Patricia's years of HOA abuse. They didn't know about the fabricated violations, the harassment, the liens on people's homes for made-up infractions. They saw a middle-aged woman losing her home and going to jail, and they decided I was the villain. Rachel organized a neighborhood meeting to address the situation. It was held at the community clubhouse, and about 40 residents showed up. Sandra came with me, just in case things got heated. Rachel stood at the front of the room and addressed the crowd. "I know there's been a lot of talk about what happened with Patricia. I want to make sure everyone understands the full story." She laid it out clearly. Patricia's rent arrears, the eviction process which had been done completely legally, the vandalism, the fake HOA violations, and finally, the attempted arson that could have killed someone. Patricia wasn't some innocent victim, Rachel said firmly. She was an abuser who used her HOA position to terrorize people for years. When someone finally stood up to her, she escalated to violence. Keith didn't do anything wrong. He collected rent that was owed and he protected his property. Patricia made her own choices and now she's facing the consequences. Donald Pierce stood up. She was a good HOA president. She kept this neighborhood looking nice. She put a lien on my house for planting the wrong color roses, Rachel shot back. Roses that were on the approved list. She cost me $3,000 in legal fees to fight her lies. How is that being a good president? Another woman stood. She fined me $200 because my 6-year-old daughter drew a smiley face on our driveway with chalk. Chalk. That washes away in the rain. I had to pay it because I couldn't afford to fight it. More people started talking, sharing their stories. The retired veteran with the flag, a couple who had been harassed because Patricia didn't like their car. A single father who had been threatened with foreclosure because he put his trash cans out at 7 p.m. instead of 8 p.m. on trash night. The stories went on for over an hour. By the end, even Donald Pierce looked uncomfortable. He hadn't known. Most of Patricia's supporters hadn't known because they had never been her targets. There's going to be an HOA election in November, I said when things quieted down. Patricia's term is up, and obviously she won't be running again. I think we need to elect someone who will actually serve this community instead of ruling over it. Rachel nodded. I'll run. If people want someone different, I'll do it. I've lived here for 8 years and I'm tired of being afraid of my own HOA. Several people clapped. Others nodded. The mood in the room had shifted from divided to unified. Patricia's reign of terror was ending, and people were ready for something better. The next few weeks were busy. Patricia's belongings were removed from the property by the sheriff's office and stored according to Arizona law. I spent a small fortune repairing the damage from the gasoline and repainting my front porch. My insurance covered most of it, but there was still a deductible and a lot of hassle. The criminal case moved forward quickly. Patricia's attorney tried to argue diminished capacity, claiming that the stress of the eviction had caused a mental breakdown. But the evidence was too clear. She had planned this. She had recruited her brother. She had bought gasoline and spread it deliberately while he prepared to light it. This wasn't a snap decision. This was premeditated attempted arson. Her brother, Derek, took a plea deal. He was looking at 15 years, and with his prior record, the prosecutor had enough to push for the maximum. He agreed to testify against Patricia in exchange for 12 years. Patricia went to trial. I had to testify, which was surreal. Sitting in a courtroom, describing how my tenant had terrorized me with fake violations and then tried to burn down my house. Patricia sat at the defense table, looking smaller and older than I remembered. She didn't look at me during my testimony. The video evidence was damning. The jury saw Patricia spreading gasoline on my door. They saw Derek with the lighter. They heard the 911 call where I reported the attempted arson in real time. It took them less than 3 hours to return a guilty verdict on all counts. At sentencing, the judge was harsh. Mrs. Henderson, you held a position of trust in your community. You were supposed to make your neighborhood better, safer. Instead, you abused your power, harassed your neighbors, and when someone finally held you accountable, you tried to commit murder. Because that's what this was. If you had succeeded in setting that house on fire, Mr. Lawson could have died. Your actions were calculated, premeditated, and showed a complete disregard for human life. Patricia was sentenced to 18 years in prison. With good behavior, she might be released in 12. but she would be almost 65 by then, and her life as she knew it was over. I should have felt satisfaction. Justice had been served. Patricia would never hurt anyone again. But mostly I just felt tired. The HOA election happened in November, just as scheduled. Rachel ran unopposed for president after I declined to run myself. I had enough drama in my life. She won by acclamation, and her first act as president was to review and dismiss every pending HOA violation in the community. She found over 200 violations that Patricia had filed, most of them against people Patricia had personal grudges against. Rachel dismissed all of them. Her second act was to revise the HOA rules to include an appeals process and term limits for board members. No one would ever be able to hold the kind of power Patricia had again. The property Patricia had rented sat empty for a while. Marcus and I debated what to do with it. Eventually, we decided to renovate it and rent it to Rachel at a reduced rate, as thanks for her testimony and her work fixing the community. She accepted, thrilled to move into a slightly larger house. Life slowly returned to normal. My other neighbors warmed up to me once they realized I wasn't some monster who had destroyed Patricia's life for no reason. The community actually started to feel like a community instead of a dictatorship. I still have the security camera footage saved, backed up in 3 different places. Sometimes I watch it, just to remind myself how close things came to going very, very wrong. Patricia looking at my house with calculation in her eyes, Derek with the lighter, the red and blue lights of the police cars arriving just in time. I learned a lot from the whole experience. I learned that some people will abuse any amount of power they're given. I learned that standing up to bullies is necessary but dangerous. I learned that documentation and evidence are everything when you're fighting someone who lies as easily as breathing. Most importantly, I learned that being a landlord is about more than collecting rent. It's about responsibility. To your tenants, yes, but also to yourself and your community. Patricia taught me that lesson the hard way. A year later, I was sitting on my porch on a Sunday morning, drinking coffee and reading the news on my tablet, when a car pulled up to Rachel's house next door. A young couple got out, looking around the neighborhood with excitement. They were holding hands and pointing at different houses, clearly house hunting. Rachel came out to greet them, and they talked for a few minutes before she led them inside for a tour. I smiled. The house across the street was for sale, and from the way the couple was looking around, they were interested. New neighbors, new energy, a fresh start. My phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. Board meeting at 2 p.m. Can you make it? Our real estate business had grown significantly over the past year. We now owned 14 rental properties in Gilbert and the surrounding areas, and we were looking at expanding into Chandler. What had started as a risky investment had turned into a legitimate business, and I was proud of what we had built. I texted back, "I'll be there." As I sat there, finishing my coffee and watching my neighborhood go about its peaceful Sunday morning, I thought about Patricia. She was in prison, probably would be for another 11 years at least. Her life had been destroyed by her own choices, her own anger, her own inability to accept that she wasn't above the rules she enforced on everyone else. Part of me wondered if things could have gone differently. If I had handled the rent situation another way, if I had been more patient, more understanding. But then I remembered the spray paint, the fake violations, the gasoline on my door and Derek with his lighter. Patricia hadn't wanted a solution. She had wanted revenge for being held accountable. Some people, when they're given a little bit of power, use it to help others. They make things better. They serve their community with humility and dedication. And some people, like Patricia Henderson, use power as a weapon. They build little kingdoms and rule them like tyrants, never realizing that all kingdoms eventually fall. I finished my coffee and went inside to get ready for the board meeting. Life moved on. The community healed, and I had work to do. The November sun was warm on my face as I locked my door and walked to my car. My cameras were still running, still recording, but I didn't watch them obsessively anymore. There was no need. Patricia was gone. The neighborhood was safe. And I had learned to trust that sometimes justice actually works the way it's supposed to. As I drove past Rachel's house, I saw the young couple coming back outside, smiling and excited. Rachel was shaking their hands. They had probably made an offer. Soon, they would be part of our community, and they would never know about Patricia or the reign of terror she had inflicted. They would just live in a nice neighborhood with reasonable HOA rules and neighbors who looked out for each other. That was Patricia's real legacy, I realized. Not the chaos she had caused, but the community that had come together to heal after she was gone. She had tried to break us, and instead, she had made us stronger. I smiled as I pulled onto the main road, heading toward Marcus's office and the next chapter of my life. The HOA drama was behind me. Patricia Henderson was a cautionary tale, a reminder that power without accountability is dangerous, and that standing up to bullies, while difficult, is always worth it in the end. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Marcus. Just saw the news. Home prices in Gilbert are up 8% this year. We bought at the right time, I grinned. Yes, we had. And despite everything, despite Patricia's attempts to destroy me, I had come out ahead. My business was thriving. My neighborhood was healing. My house was safe and mine. Patricia had demanded I clear her walkway from imaginary snow that summer morning so long ago. She had treated me like hired help, like someone beneath her notice, except as a target for her tyranny. She had never imagined that I was actually her landlord, that I held power over her housing security, or that her own actions would lead to her downfall. The irony was perfect. The HOA president who wielded power like a cudgel had been undone by the very system she thought she controlled. And the neighbor she had dismissed and harassed had been the one person who could, and would, hold her accountable. I thought about that moment at my door, Patricia demanding I clear snow in 90-degree Arizona heat, and I laughed. If she had just been a decent person, a fair neighbor, a reasonable tenant, none of this would have happened. She could have kept her house, her position, her freedom. Instead, she chose tyranny, and tyranny had consumed her. As I merged onto the highway, leaving Riverside Meadows behind me, I made a mental note to thank Sandra again for her excellent legal work, and to thank Rachel for stepping up to lead the HOA with the integrity Patricia had lacked, and to thank Marcus for being a solid business partner through all the chaos. But mostly, I made a note to remember this lesson. Treat people with respect, follow your own rules, and never underestimate the quiet man who isn't arguing back. Because sometimes that quiet man is your landlord, and karma, when it arrives, is swift and merciless. The sun was high and bright, the Arizona sky that perfect shade of blue that made everything feel possible. I had survived Patricia Henderson's worst. I had built something good from the ashes of her attempted destruction, and I was moving forward, stronger and wiser than before. The story of the HOA Karen who demanded I clear her walkway and discovered I was her landlord evicting her would become neighborhood legend, I knew. People would tell it for years, a cautionary tale about the dangers of petty tyranny and the importance of treating everyone with basic human decency. And somewhere in a prison cell, Patricia Henderson would have 12 years to think about how different things could have been if she had just paid her rent and been a decent human being. 12 years to realize that the power she had wielded so carelessly had been an illusion, and that real power comes from integrity, fairness, and respect. I hoped she learned that lesson. But I also knew that people like Patricia rarely change. They blame everyone else for their problems, never looking inward, never accepting responsibility for their own actions. She probably still thought I was the villain in this story, but I knew the truth, and so did everyone who mattered. I had done nothing wrong. I had simply stood my ground, followed the law, and refused to be bullied. And in the end, that had been enough. The board meeting was productive. We discussed expansion plans, reviewed tenant applications, and talked about market trends. It was good, solid business, the kind of work that built wealth slowly and steadily. Marcus and I were building something that would last, something we could be proud of. After the meeting, Marcus and I grabbed dinner at a local restaurant. We talked about families, hobbies, plans for the future. We didn't talk about Patricia. That chapter was closed, the book finished and shelved. When I got home that evening, the neighborhood was quiet and peaceful. Families were having dinner. Kids were playing in yards. Someone was grilling, and the smell of barbecue drifted through the warm air. It was normal and lovely, exactly what a neighborhood should be. I sat on my porch again, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. My cameras were running, but there was nothing to see. No threats, no drama, just peace. Rachel came out of her house next door and waved. "Hey Keith, want to come over for a beer? Brad is grilling." I smiled and stood. "Yeah, that sounds great." As I walked over to my neighbor's house, to spend an evening with friends in the community I had fought so hard to protect, I felt something I hadn't felt since moving to Riverside Meadows. I felt at home. Patricia Henderson had tried to make this neighborhood her personal kingdom. She had ruled through fear and intimidation, using the HOA as her weapon of choice. But kingdoms fall, tyrants are deposed, and in the end, community wins. I had won. We had all won, and that finally was enough.